So I'm delighted to introduce Barbara Mearns this evening, who's going to talk to us about biographies for birdwatchers, and I'm intrigued to know exactly what that's going to cover. Barbara is a lifelong birder who also records dragonflies, butterflies and moths in southwest Scotland, where she lives with her husband, Richard. Together, they have followed in the footsteps of early naturalists in Europe, North America, the Middle East and Mongolia. And tonight she's going to talk to us about biographies for birdwatchers. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing and I'm going to pass you over to Barbara.
Thanks, Maria. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
You're slightly quiet. I don't know if you...
I'll come a little bit closer and I can speak up if that helps.
Yeah.
How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, good. So, hello, everybody. This evening, I want to tell you about 20 people who've had birds named after them. And if you're a British birder, then many of their names will be familiar to you, but quite possibly some will be new. Avian eponyms do something very important. They don't just celebrate naturalists, they also open a window into the past, into the history of ornithology. So tonight, we're going to romp through 3 centuries of ornithological history, from Steller of Steller's eider, born in 1709, through to conservationists who are living and working today. Now, time to share my screen. How's that?
So we've got, yeah, perfect. It's gone to, that's right. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Good. Right, thanks. So my husband Richard and I have been researching the lives of these naturalists off and on since the 1980s. And much of this talk will be based on our recent book, which is our revised and updated biographies for birdwatchers. And this slide is taken from the cover, showing Pallas and Pallas's sandgrouse. More of that later. Much of our research, of course, was done in libraries, but we've often planned birding holidays to follow in the footsteps of the great explorers. So I'm going to take you travelling, but we'll finish up in London. Our story began in Alaska in 1983, when Richard and I were there photographing grey plovers at the nest out on the Seward Peninsula, which you see here. In the space of just a few weeks, we saw Wilson's warblers in the willow scrub. We saw Baird sandpipers out on the tundra. We saw Sabine's gulls flying along the coast. And we saw Steller's eiders in tight little bunches out at sea. But we realized that we didn't know anything about any of these people. So we decided that when we got home, we would find out about them. And we discovered that Georg Wilhelm Steller was the first European naturalist to watch and study the Alaskan wildlife. We got hold of a biography by Leonard Stejneger, and we discovered that he was part of a Russian expedition in the 1700s, which sailed all the way down the Aleutian chain. Steller was on board with Vitus Bering, the expedition leader. In fact, they shared a cabin, but it was a very unhappy relationship. Steller, like all ship's naturalists, wanted to spend as much time ashore as possible, and Bering grudged him every single minute. Ironically, things didn't improve for Steller until they got shipwrecked. Once he was stuck on an uninhabited, treeless island, his dreams began to become true. And for the next 8 months, he was able to study the Alaskan wildlife every single day. He watched Steller's eider offshore. He described the sea lions and the Steller's sea cows, which are also called manatees. He watched them grazing offshore, sometimes with gulls perched on their backs. He watched sea otters, and he put a hide up in the middle of a fur seal colony so that he could watch the big bulls coming ashore in the spring, fighting over their harems, and he marveled over the way in which the females could find their own pups amidst hundreds of others. Although their ship had been wrecked, it had been washed up onto the beach. And so in the spring, the sailors broke it up and built a smaller vessel, and the survivors were able to get back to the Siberian mainland. But tragically, on the long overland journey back to St. Petersburg, Steller got fever and died at the age of just 37. But he packed a lot into a short life, and I think his career would make a wonderful movie. Edward Sabine of Sabine's Gull made 2 Arctic voyages in search of the Northwest Passage. On the first, he was traveling with James Clark Ross of Ross's Gull fame, and as they sailed past some low-lying islands where Arctic terns were nesting, they noticed a few gulls which they didn't recognize in amongst them, so they went to shore, they shot a few, they prepared the skins, and when they encountered a whaling ship passing by, they handed the gulls over addressed to Sabine's brother in London, and he named them Larus sabini. Spencer Fullerton Baird was one of the great American ornithologists of the 1800s. For decades, he was the director of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And he organized and arranged for many, many young men to be out collecting across North America. He was one of the real movers and shakers of American ornithology, so it seems very appropriate that Baird's Sandpiper is named in his memory. I particularly want to tell you about Alexander Wilson, because he was born in Paisley in Renfrewshire, which is my own home county. Wilson was a Paisley weaver. The town at that time was famous for its weavers. And he worked for many years at the loom, but he was politically active when mill owners were cheating and exploiting some of the workers. Wilson tried to do something about it, and sadly he fell foul of the law and ended up in jail for a while. This lovely statue of him is outside Paisley Abbey. But although he's well recognised and admired in Scotland now, when he came out of jail, he realised that he had rather a bleak future ahead of him in Scotland, and so he emigrated. And he arrived in the United States at the age of 28, owning nothing except his flute and his fowling piece. And so for the next 12 years, he took whatever jobs he could get, mostly working as a school teacher. But in his spare time, what he really loved was watching the American birds. Not just watching them, but he began to draw them and to paint them. And he began to dream about providing the definitive bird book about all the American birds. It wasn't such a daft idea. He was a highly educated guy, having already produced a book of poems in Scotland. But he had a lot to learn, and he realized it. Fortunately, after about 12 years, he was able to give up the day job when he found a publisher willing to take his project on. So in 1806, he began full-time work on the American ornithology. Wilson didn't like shooting and killing birds. He much preferred to keep them as pets and to paint from life. And here you see a brown-headed cowbird, one of the many species which he kept as a pet for a time. And he found it in the nest of a yellowthroat. Cowbirds are like cuckoos. They lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. And Wilson found many cowbird chicks in yellowthroat nests. And I think some of his loveliest paintings are of the birds he was really familiar with, like these. Here's another which he knew well, the whippoorwill. And if you just look down the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a little chick, which again, he painted from life. He was walking through the woods one day in June when a whippoorwill got up from his feet and put on a distraction display. And Wilson knew enough to stand still, to scan the ground around him till he spotted this little scrap of fluff. And then he sat down and he sketched it. He hasn't just left us lovely paintings, he's left us some really useful eyewitness accounts of the American birds, particularly important, I think, the species that are now extinct, like the passenger pigeon, which you see here. And while he was working on his book, he made several expeditions. The longest one, his home was near Philadelphia. He headed inland to the Ohio River, got himself a little rowing boat and rowed down the Ohio, And then he got a horse and rode through Kentucky and Tennessee all the way down to the Gulf Coast. On the way, as he was going through Kentucky, passenger pigeons began flying overhead, and it became a vast flock stretching from one horizon all the way to the other. This is what he wrote. Curious to determine how long this appearance would continue, I took out my watch to note the time and sat down to observe them. It was then 1:30. I sat for more than an hour. Instead of a diminution of this prodigious procession, it seemed rather to increase, both in number and rapidity, and anxious to reach Frankfurt before the night, I rose and went on. They were still passing over at 6 in the evening. The number has been estimated at over 2,000 million. Quite an incredible legacy to leave. So, by the time we read about some of these naturalists and a few others, we thought that it would make, if we put together all the people who had Western Palearctic birds named after them, it would make a really interesting book. And so Richard and I split about 90 people up between us, and we each researched and wrote our own chapters. And the book came out in 1988. We also thought, while we were working on the book, that it would be nice to see some of these species that we were writing about. And so we made a couple of trips, and on these we took photographs which were later used by Darren Rees in some of his lovely illustrations. And here's one of Darren's illustrations from a photograph we took off the coast of southwest Sardinia, looking out at the island of Toro. We didn't just want to see Eleanor's falcons, we wanted to see them here, because this is where, in 1830, Alberto de la Marmora sailed out to the island with local fishermen and bagged a species new to science. And so we sat there with the island shimmering in the heat, thinking of Marmora and watching the falcons flying past. Marmora sent his specimens to an Italian naturalist called Genet, and Genet decided to call them after Eleanor of Arborea, the great Sardinian heroine, because when her territory was invaded in the 1300s, she led her troops into battle, riding out at their head. And she also introduced a really important code of laws, which was extremely enlightened for the time. She accepted that criminals had to be punished, but she didn't want wives and children to suffer unduly. And so, for example, she said that when men were punished, their land and possessions were not to be confiscated. But I think the law which clinched it for Genet was that she forbade the taking of falcons from the nest. Now, that was pretty standard in the Mediterranean. It protected the falcons for falconers. But still, it was a good reason to name the bird after her. Marmora, who discovered the falcons, was an amazing character, a man of parts, as they say. And I love this picture of him. It doesn't just show him as an all-round naturalist. You can also see him prepared to measure the weather, to record the weather and to record the topography of Sardinia. And in fact, he mapped the island for many years. And the highest mountain there is also named after him, as well as Marmora's warbler, which was one of his own discoveries. He was born in Turin, and he was interested in birds all his life, but he wasn't a professional naturalist. He was actually a professional soldier. He studied in Paris and fought for a time for Napoleon, and was even awarded with the Legion d'Honneur by the emperor himself. But I think this is a wonderful painting by Marmora of Bonelli's eagles. It looks a little bit like a modern field guide. He spent a lot of time studying these birds. He even put up a hide so that he could watch them at the nest and study their diet. And at that time, because so often naturalists had to identify a bird in the hand after shooting it, rather than they didn't have binoculars to watch it from a distance. So often they were just studying the bird in the hand. And so he also illustrated these feathers to make it easier for them. Here you see Franco Andrea Bonelli, and he was one of the most important Italian zoologists of his generation. He was a professor of zoology at Turin, and here you see him with a Bonelli's eagle sitting on his table, and that's because his friend Marmora brought him a live eaglet, and he kept it for some years so that he could study its plumage. But the story of Benelli is rather sad. He was impoverished and as a result wasn't able to marry until the age of 30, and by that time his health was already deteriorating. His sight began to fail, and he had to give up the study of insects, which was his real passion. He died at the age of 46. Another bird which Richard and I particularly wanted to see was Tristram's starlings. And again, we wanted to see them where they'd first been discovered. And so we went to the monastery of Marsaba in the Judean desert in Israel. And when Richard was out of work for a while, we spent 2.5 months in Israel. So we saw a lot of beautiful birds, not just Tristram's starlings or Tristram's grackles, as they're sometimes called. Canon Henry Baker Tristram was a clergyman as well as being a naturalist. And you see him here with his big red bushy beard in his traveling clothes, although he was in fact in a studio in England, probably Durham, where he was the canon of Durham Cathedral. So it was as a clergyman and a naturalist that he had a special interest in the birds of the Holy Land. And he wrote quite a number of books about the Middle East. He made numerous expeditions there. This is an illustration from one of his books, The Land of Israel, and it shows him crossing the Jordan with his friends and getting pretty wet in the process. Tristram, unlike Wilson, never traveled alone. He usually took a few friends with him who were also naturalists, and he always hired a bunch of local men to smooth the way and do the camp chores so that he and his friends could spend all their time watching and collecting the wildlife. Another of his books was The Fauna and Flora of Palestine. And beautiful illustrations in this book just show that he wasn't just interested in birds, although he was primarily a bird collector and an ornithologist. He was interested in every aspect of natural history, and on a number of his trips, he took small mammal traps so that they could find out which mammals were in the area. One of his most popular books was The Natural History of the Bible, which came out in a number of editions. And when you look at the pictures here, you realize how much things have changed in the last 150 years. When Tristram was in Palestine, there were still crocodiles in at least one river, and there were still bears in some of the ravines in Galilee. Tristram didn't just write quite a number of books about the Middle East, and not just Israel, but some of the adjacent countries like Lebanon and Jordan and Syria, that he's actually held in very high regard in Israel today, because they realize that this is the man who laid the foundations of natural history. When they want to know how much things have changed, they go to Tristram. He really did a tremendous amount of very careful observation of wildlife and gave wonderful information on the distribution of species. Well, Tristram grew up in Northumbria, and so did this man, Thomas Bewick. You probably know a bit about Bewick already, one of the best known of our eponyms. Even as a boy, Bewick loved to draw and paint. And so as a result, he was apprenticed to an engraver in Newcastle. And in time, he became a master of the art of wood engraving. His influence as an ornithologist was very slight, but his influence as an artist was enormous. And Bewick's swan was named by William Yarrell and some of his friends 2 years after Bewick died, simply because of their huge respect for Bewick as a naturalist and as an artist, really, as a naturalist and as an artist. So all these people were in our first book about biographies for birdwatchers. But when Richard retired, he decided he would revise and update it, which he finished a couple of years ago. And the reason he did that was because by this time, 30 years had passed. The first Biographies for Birdwatchers was out of print, and because we kept up our interest and kept in touch with various people, we had a lot more information. But also, the number of Western Palearctic species had enormously increased. New species had been added to the list, some of them because they'd turned up in the region for the first time, and some of them, like Montero's petrel, because they'd been split. And also new subspecies had been added. And I mentioned earlier how important these stories are in helping us to understand the history of ornithology. And we thought if we updated the book, it would introduce people to a whole new generation of ornithologists, people who are now working in conservation and research biology, behavioral science, DNA, and isotope studies. And so what I want to do next is just tell you very quickly about a few of these much more recent naturalists. And I want to start with a Portuguese ornithologist called Luís Rocha Monteiro, who very tragically died in a plane crash at the age of 37. But like Stella, he packed a lot into a short life. He was a seabird specialist. At university, he studied environmental engineering. And then for his doctorate, he studied the effects of heavy metal pollution on seabirds in the Azores. And it was because of the work he did on Azorean seabirds, particularly the Madeiran storm petrel, that other scientists after his death were able to split Montero's from Madeiran. He did so much work into their ecology and diet. And so it was in 2008 that Oceanodroma Montero was named by a small group of scientists. I'm very glad to be able to include Effie Waugh, because Richard and I first met her back in the 80s when we were working on the first Biographies for Birdwatchers and our book after that, when we visited the Rothschild Library in Tring, where Effie was the librarian. And she didn't just help us on that occasion, she sent us countless photocopies afterwards. She's probably been acknowledged in more bird books in recent years than anybody else. She's helped a lot of authors, ornithologists and biographers. And here you see her being awarded a painting of the basalt wheatear, which was named Enanthe warrii just in 2011. It seems entirely appropriate that a Middle Eastern wheatear should be named after Effie, because she and her husband lived in the United Arab Emirates for some years. They've done work on the birds of the Middle East, and she's served on the Ornithological Society of the Middle East in many ways for a time on their council. And if you've ever been to the bird fair and gone to the Osmi stand, you've probably met her and her husband manning it. When Guy Kirwan and Hadram Sherahai named the bird, this is what they said. Over many years, she has provided innumerable ornithologists with countless courtesies. She's one of the unsung backroom heroes of modern ornithology. And with that, I would heartily agree. Hedwig Sauer-Gerth is a German ornithologist. She's a laboratory research assistant, and it was because of her DNA studies that this race of African blue-tit was named after her. She's also been very involved in a number of environmental organizations, such as Greenpeace and animal welfare organizations. And for a time, she organized goose ringing work near her home in Heidelberg. Well, there's another reason why there are far more people in the revised Biographies for Birdwatchers than there were in the original. And one of them is that we decided to take a more generous view of the Western Palearctic. And so this map shows you what's sometimes called the Greater Western Palearctic. And basically it means that this time we included the region in green. And that allowed us to include some Russians like Zarudny and Plesky. In fact, Richard did a lot of Russian material translated into English to make some of the information available to us for the first time. It enabled us to include Philby's partridge, named after Harry St. John Philby, who is famous for his exploration of Arabia and infamous as being the father of the spy King Philby. And we were able to include birds like the Arabian scops owl, Otis pameli, named for Pamela Posson, who during World War II served in the Eastern Mediterranean was the Special Operations Executive, and many other people. But again, we continued just trying to see some of the birds we were writing about. And in June 2018, Richard and I went with friends to Madeira, the main island, and also we went out to one of the offshore islands, Deserta Grande, in search of petrels. If you haven't been, just a few photographs to show you how beautiful Madeira can be up in the mountains at that time of year. Pretty lush in places, a bit more barren and bleak once you get really high up. And we had the huge privilege of going into the mountains at night with Frank Zeno and his wife, Buffy, after whom Zeno's petrel is named. And it was in their company that we were able to hear Zeno's petrels flying around and calling wonderful, mournful wails. It was a terrific experience. The bird, which we now know as Zeno's petrel, first became known to ornithologists back in the early 1900s, but then it wasn't seen again until the 1960s, and it was assumed to be extinct. But when a couple of birds crash landed into the streets of Funchal, Alex Zeno realized that the birds were still somewhere on Madeira, perhaps breeding in the mountains, and that it would be good to find the colony. And he and Frank went in search of them. But you've seen these mountains, you know how rugged they are. And to make searching for a breeding colony even more difficult, these petrels, of course, only come ashore at night under cover of darkness. And so for quite some time, they had absolutely no success in trying to find the birds. But then they had a brainwave. So they thought, why don't we play a recording of the calls of a closely related species, the deserter's petrel, to the shepherds who spend the night in the mountains. Maybe they can help us. So they did that, and a shepherd called Lucas said, yes, he knew this sound, but he hadn't realized it was a bird. He had thought he was listening to the ghosts of shepherds who had died in the mountains. But he took them to the spot, and they located a colony. And ever since, they've done all they can to protect it from rats and cats and fire and erosion, all the things that can threaten this very small seabird colony. And both Alec and Frank have been involved for many years, throughout their lives really, in not just studying Zeno's petrels, but in protecting the petrels on Deserta Grande and particularly on the more distant Salvagin Islands. They're both, the whole family have been outstanding conservationists. It was a real treat to meet Frank and Buffy. It was also a real treat to go out to Deserta Grande. The holiday had been really planned around an overnight trip with a local tour group. And so here you see us approaching Deserta Grande on a beautifully calm day, and there were bulbous petrels, the bird we most wanted to see, flying around us. When we landed, we realized how bleak and hot and barren the island was, and we looked forward to dusk when it got a little bit cooler and the birds began to come ashore. And our guides took us on a little well-worn trail around the bay and showed us this bulbous petrel at the nest, sitting on the egg that it incubates for 6 weeks. And that night, Richard and I slept in our tent, listening to bulbous petrels and Corey's shearwaters calling and wailing around us. And of course, we inevitably thought about the Reverend James Bulwer, after whom the petrel was named. He spent 2 winters in Madeira, and like us, he went out to Deserta Grande one night, and that was probably where, in 1825, he took the first specimens of Bulwer's petrel known to science and sent them to his friend Sir William Jarden, who had it illustrated in his book, Illustrations of Ornithology, in 1826. Well, here's a question. Is this Corey shearwater? If you're British, you'll look at it and say, yes, of course it is. It's a Corey shearwater. But if you're an American, in a couple of years' time, you'll be calling it something else. Because back in November, the Americans decided that they were going to get rid of all their avian eponyms. The plan is that over the next couple of years, they'll abolish 70 to 80. And then in the next decade, they'll abolish another 70 to 80. They really want to get rid of them altogether. And I'm sure you'll appreciate that Rick and I really, really regret this decision. But it seems only fair to let the AOS explain why in their own words. And so I'm going to read what the executive director, Dr. Judith Scull, said in her press release in November. Can I get rid of this little box I've got on the right here? It's just hiding some of it. I think I can minimize it, can I?
You can probably minimize it for
There we
yourself.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've minimized it. Thank you. So she said, as scientists, we work to eliminate bias in science, but there has been historic bias in how birds are named and who might have a bird named in their honor. Exclusionary naming, developed in the 1800s, clouded by racism and misogyny, don't work for us today. And the time has come for us to transform this process and redirect the focus to the birds where it belongs. I'm proud to be part of this new vision, and I'm excited to work in partnership with a broad array of experts and bird lovers in creating an inclusive naming structure. Well, I think it's a wonderful ambition. If they can reduce racism, if they can make American birding world more inclusive, more welcoming to all kinds of people, then that will be a wonderful thing. And I really hope that they'll be successful. I really do. I would love to be proved wrong, but it doesn't seem to us that this is the best way of going about it. However, I don't want to start pontificating on the subject. I might not stop. So let's move on to Peter Simon Pallas, because he is the man who has more Western Palearctic birds named after him than anybody else. He was one of the great explorer naturalists of his lifetime. And here we are. He described as new to science hundreds of species, 425 species of birds, 240 species of fish, 150 species of mammals, plus amphibians and reptiles and insects and plants, and on it goes. An amazing man. So here's just a little potted history of his early life. He was born in Berlin, and from 1758 to 1760, he studied medicine in Germany and the Netherlands. And then in 1761, he visited London for 10 months to improve his medical and surgical knowledge. And then he studied medicine for 4 years at The Hague. But while he was doing that, he was also spending time in the museum looking at skins, and he published original descriptions of little tern and spotted redshank and sanderling and ruddy shelduck. And then in 1767, Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, invited him to move to the Academy of Sciences at St. Petersburg, and he spent the next 43 years there. I think there was perhaps an additional reason. He didn't just go because he wanted to study the wildlife of Russia. He went with his lover, who had run away from her husband. Maybe it was a good thing to put some space between them. Well, sadly, I can't say I've followed in Pallas's footsteps, but he spent 6 years traveling, a 6-year expedition from St. Petersburg eastwards. They traveled across the Urals, through the Altai Mountains, all the way to Lake Baikal, and then into northern Mongolia. He was one of the real pioneers of Mongolian ornithology. And a few years ago, Richard and I made a couple of trips to Mongolia. So although we weren't in his footsteps, we were, I think, bird watching in the sort of habitats that he was familiar with. And so on some of the great big lakes, we watched Pallas's gull. On some of the immense braided rivers, we watched Pallas's fish eagles hunting in the evening. And in many different habitats, including swampy places like this, we saw Pallas's reed bunting. And perhaps best of all, we saw our first Pallas's sand grouse in sandy deserts and out on the immense steppe. When Pallas returned to St. Petersburg at the end of 6 years, he had discovered so many new species. He had such an amazing time, but he longed to go home. Catherine had other ideas. She persuaded him to stay and to become the personal tutor to her sons, the Grand Dukes. And she was very reluctant to let him return, so much so that he didn't get back to Berlin until the year before his death. Well, I want to finish with just a few of the people who've served the Natural History Museum in London, and then one more Londoner. So here is Richard Baudler Sharp, who served in the British Museum for, I think, 50, no, I'm not sure how long, certainly for much of his life. And the Iberian green woodpecker, Picus sharpii, was named in his honour. He was born at Snow Hill in London. And as a young man, he produced a monograph on the kingfishers of the world, working from the museum specimens. The illustrations were absolutely beautiful, stunning ones by J.G. Ceulemans, and it helped, I think, for Sharp that his father was a publisher. But the staff at the museum were so impressed by his monograph that they offered him a job, and so he worked at the museum for the rest of his life. When Sharp began working there, the museum owned 32,000 bird skins. By the time he died, they had 500,000. And that was in large part because of the respect that British ornithologists had for Sharp. They knew that if they gifted or sold their collections to the museum in London, they would be really well looked after. And that's so important because collections can easily be damaged by moth and damp. They knew he would take good care of him. They also knew that Sharp would use the collections and that other ornithologists would have the opportunity to use the collections, that they wouldn't be wasted. But I find now that a lot of bird watchers simply don't appreciate the importance of these early collections. In fact, we're all indebted to these collectors. If we have a field guide or if we're ringers, we benefit all the time. Every artist who works on a field guide has to use museum specimens, however wide their experience in the field. They can't possibly be familiar with every species in every plumage. And if you're a ringer and you use Lars Svensson's identification guide to European passerines, then you may or may not know that by the time he produced the 4th edition, he had studied 35,000 skins, which is pretty amazing. One day, when Sharp was in his 50s, he went into work in the bird room as usual, and a young woman, just 19 years old, called Dorothea Bate, came in and asked him for a job. Now, at that time, there were no female scientists working in the museum. And I think some of the curators would probably have told her to go away and not be silly. But Sharp had 10 daughters, and he was impressed by her. He got her to look at some of the skins and tell him about them. And it was obvious that she really knew a lot about birds. And so he offered her a job, which was a really good decision because she stayed with the museum for the next 50 years. And she made a real name for herself as one of the world's great paleontologists. And here you see a little plaque from her birthplace in Carmarthen. But on her first expedition, she went to Cyprus and afterwards published a paper in Ibis about some of the birds there, including the short-toed tree creeper. And so the Cypriot race has been named in her memory. And if you'd like to know more about her, there's a very good biography called Discovering Dorothea. Now, I've chosen to talk about a few women tonight, but it has to be said that across biographies for birdwatchers as a whole, only 6% of the biographies are of women. And that reflects the history of ornithology. It was mostly men during the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, although things have fortunately changed more recently. But I just wanted to mention Thekla's lark because very unusually, it's named after 2 women. Firstly, it was named Galerida Thekli after Thekla Brehm, a young woman who died at the age of 24, and her grieving father and brother named this lark they'd recently discovered in her memory. And then the race, which you find in the deserts of Morocco, was named after Theresa Clay. But I'm not going to say much about her because she wasn't an ornithologist. Her real interest, although she worked at the museum for 40 years, was in the parasites that you find in the feathers of birds. I want to finish by talking about William Yarrell, because he was one of the most influential ornithologists of the 1800s. And he had a bookshop, booksellers and newsagents in the heart of London, between Piccadilly and Pall Mall. And so he supplied the newspapers every day to the royal family and to the Houses of Parliament. And the British race of the pied wagtail has been named after him. I thought it'd be nice to finish with a bird that everybody's familiar with. And this is what he's most famous for, A History of British Birds by William Yarrell. This book went into many editions and it was a real groundbreaker. You'll notice, rather obviously, it's not at all like the lavish productions with hand-tinted plates that Sharp was producing. This was a small black and white book that was within the, that was popular. Most people could afford to buy this book. And so a whole generation of birders relied on it. He also did something else very novel. He tried to describe the distribution of British birds. Not easy to do when you're based in London and you're running a busy business, but he had a huge network of correspondence throughout the British Isles, which made it possible. And so this is a book which was both influential and popular. And I'd love to be able to say the same about this book, although I probably can't because we've only printed 300 of them. But if you would like to know more about some of these people, then here are the order details. And I should point out that because we've published it ourselves, it's only available through Wildside Books. So the contact details are important, although if you forget them, you just have to go to our own website, mearnsbooks.com, and you'll find a link to Alan Gibbard at Wildside Books. Something else I was going to say. Yes, I wanted to say we published it ourselves because it gave us quality control and it also enabled us to keep down the price. I'd just like to finish by saying a thank you to Peter Harris for his photographs of Alaska and Madeira. When we went to Alaska, we were taking slides. So it was good to have his digital images, and to thank Yoav Perlman for his beautiful basalt wheat here. So thank you for listening. I hope you're still there.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Yes, we are all still here. And I just wanted to say how interesting it was to get a kind of glimpse into those different lives of people that have contributed to ornithology over the years, and how beautifully illustrated the talk was. You know, the combination of the paintings and the engravings and the lovely photographs as well it was just visually really great to look through. I really enjoyed it, and I have to say I particularly liked the Alberto della Marmara, where he's kind of got all his naturalistic.
Oh, yes,
it kind of made us think a little bit about some of us in the LNHS, and you know, not a million miles away with all our bits and pieces and nets and books and things with us as well. So that particularly made me smile. I'm going to stop. Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we'll go over. We've got some questions into the chat. If you've got questions, do pop them in and we'll get to them very shortly.
Right, and I'll stop sharing